All right, we are live here on YouTube today. It is Thursday, and this is part of the NeuroDrive team's Autistics in the Workforce campaign this month as part of our neurodistinct workforce movement. So I am joined by my NeuroDrive team member, Ms. Jessica Michaels. I'm Carol Jean Whittington, founder and principal of Mind Your Autistic Brain and the alignment director for the NeuroDrive team, where we help companies and individuals find their thrive in the workplace. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are thrilled that you are here. Make sure that you're joining in with the live chat box, share your questions, share your experiences in workplace culture and personal brand and workplace well-being, and just, hey, being a neurodivergent human in the world. We're so thrilled to be sharing some of our insights and experiences here with you today. So I am joined by Stacey Andrews from Better Eyes, Tracy Borison from TLB Coaching and Events, and of course, my wonderful team member, Jessica Michaels, who is also known as the Neurodiverse Work Coach. Ladies, I would love for you to introduce yourselves. We'll start with Stacey.
All right. Thank you for having me so much. I'm honored to be part of this group. And so I work with Benu Rise Consulting is our firm that I love the word thrive that you just mentioned, Carol. That's what we do. We help teams thrive by building them with the recruiting and placement services, as well as the team building sessions that we customize, and leadership consulting, heavily involved in the neurodiversity element of that and how that relates to all of the things we're going to talk about today, the culture and the values and articulating those and living those out. So we help organizations to build teams that thrive together and individually.
I love that. I love that. Oh man, that so speaks to my heart. And I know it speaks to everybody in this room. Tracy Borson.
I was like, I'm so used to facilitating. I'm just going to hop right in here. Hey, everybody. My name is Tracy Borison. I am the owner of TLB Coaching and Events, as Caroline mentioned. But one of the things I'm most proud of is my co-founding and chief peepery over at the Your Business Peeps community. And everything I am about is creating spaces for people to be authentic. And I'm a big believer in that authenticity looks different on every person. And authenticity isn't about looking a specific way on social media or in the workplace or anywhere. It's about finding the permission to do you. And so everything I do is in that arena. I love hosting conversations. I do one-on-one coaching. It's just really about finding your you, finding your confidence in you, and then being able to bring that wherever you need to go to create the impact you want to have.
Oh, that's what I love. And Your Business Peeps is one of my favorite communities to hang out in for sure. And there is a networking event tonight for anybody that wants to check out Your Business Peeps, by the way. Jessica, let everybody know who you are, my spectacular friend.
I am Jessica Michaels. I am the owner of the Neurodiverse Workplace and part of Carol Jean's wonderful team at NeuroDrive. I am autistic and ADHD, late diagnosed in my late 30s, and then have used my expertise in adult education as a corporate trainer and instructional designer to help kind of piece together the pieces of the neuro divide, which is, this idea that, there's this set of professional people who look at like, act alike, sound alike, and then there's this other group of people who are divergent from that, different from that for whatever reason, and, helping all of those pieces come together. I do have a book coming out called One Size Fits No One, and you can go to my website at coachjessicamichaels.com and sign up to be on the email list to be the first to know when that book comes out.
I am so glad you shared that, because I was ready to slide it in there if you forgot about it. I know you haven't forgotten about it. We talk about it almost weekly, if not daily. So guys, we're here to talk about culture today and what that means in neurodiversity efforts. Because, that's a big buzzword. It's out there. You see it. You see companies touting that we are neurodiversity affirming. We're a neurodiverse culture. And, I had a conversation with someone yesterday who's in higher education, And he said, I've been a little disappointed. I've been a little let down because I got into working in accessibility and the neurodiversity aspect of higher education. And he said, they pay a lot of lip service and there's not a lot of action because I've brought all these different projects and all these different things to really help our students. And they keep telling me it's just not in the budget, or we'll have to maybe look at that next year. And, a lot of times it becomes this box that people tick because they feel like they should, we talk about shooting yourself to death. They feel like they should do it because everybody else is doing it. But when it comes to culture, I think one of the biggest things as the alignment director, this is what I'm always talking about, is how does our company culture align with the values we've identified at our foundation? And before we start building and adding on layers of neurodiversity, we got to really check in with, well, what is it that we value about this? Why do we value it, as leadership, as a company? And how do we start aligning and integrating that authentically and like really not just putting it on a website because we think it makes us fit in or look better? What are your thoughts on this, guys? Anybody jump in? Feel free.
I always think it's such a cop-out when people say, well, we have a neurodiverse culture. Yeah, you do, because people work there. So automatically, you've got your neurodiverse culture. Now, are you doing anything to support the individuals that are there? Are you doing anything to make it a positive place for people of many different communication and work styles? Probably not. But just by virtue of being an employer, we know that statistically, the numbers are kind of everywhere, but upwards of 30% of individuals are likely what we would consider today neurodivergent. And so they're already in your workplace. But if you're not doing anything to make it a great space for them, then you're not doing quite as well as you think you are.
Definitely. And
I know you got thoughts.
Yeah. You hit the nail on the head with just about every element of why I do what I do and my life purpose in the culture as a word, neurodiversity as a word, diversity, all of those words are just like you mentioned, Carol Jean, are ways in which you can check a box. And we are not in an environment today in the workplace where anybody wants to see boxes checked. Nobody cares. That's actually really insulting to the people working in those environments. And I'd actually rather you not even address it until you're ready to do the work than come out and say your kind of hot button thing. So the budgeting, I heard this mentioned in the last part of this series by Emily, this budgeting idea that we have to put in tons of money into these accommodations and a workplace that's inclusive is just not true. To be a culture that highlights the values, articulates those values, and makes those clear, those are really intersectional when it comes to the accommodations of neurodiversity and everybody else too. It's not about putting in a bunch of money and having a program and checking a box. It's about creating an environment where everybody communicates, works together, and has the space to figure out what's going to work. It's not as black and white as, yes, we're neurodiversity friendly. No, we're not. It's about having a culture that is open and inclusive to have those conversations and find out what works for everyone.
Well, can I throw something in here? Because one of the things, the thing that I'm just thinking is that for since the 80s, for sure, work has been based on doing things. And so all of this box checking is based on doing a thing, right? We're going to go to work, we're going to do things, we're going to check boxes. We have all these job tasks we do the tasks, and that's what humans are. Right? We're just people who go and check a box. And I think that we need to know this, right? We need to be cognizant of the fact that the entire world of work right now is built on this principle that we go to work and we check boxes about doing a thing. So it's not super surprising that when we say now we want to have diversity initiatives. Now we want to have neurodiversity initiatives. Now we want to have women in the workplace initiatives, that we look at it from a check the box perspective, because that's what the world of work has been built on for the last 40 years. And what we're talking about is shifting the entire world of work from a doing attitude to a being attitude. And this is why the coaching is imperative in that, because you can't just move from doing to being. It's just not possible, right? You need to explore what are the things that you've been doing that really aren't a part of you, but they're a part of what we think the world of work is. And how do we peel away those layers without people getting so attached to the fact that that's the way they did it for a lot of their career? Because it's funny, I've been talking about this for like all this week. We have a generation of leaders that have been built that way. And in order to transition them out of that, not that they don't want to be transitioned out of that, but in order to transition them out of that, they need to be coached, right? And I think that's what people like us on this panel have seen, right? Because this is what we show up and do, is we coach people so that they can get into the being space instead of the doing space, because we know the doing space doesn't work, but we can't just flick on the light switch and be like, okay, great, we're all in being now, and we can just move on and pretend that never happened.
And guys, if you haven't heard it yet, this week's episode on the Mind Your Autistic Brain talk show, episode 95, features an amazing culture conversation with this lady, Tracy Borison. So as we're like talking about this, because, you know, it's not about checking the box really, and it's about an alignment of our values, and also looking at, you know, Jessica talks about this, and I love this, because correct me, because, you know, numbers are not always sticking in my brain, but, you know, from the research I've looked at, it's anywhere from like 20 to almost 50% of the population in the workforce is either aware or unaware that they are neurodivergent. And so I think we take like the median and say, okay, somewhere in the ballpark of 30% of your employment talent pool is already neurodivergent. They're already there, folks. And one of the things, you know, we got a lot of chats going through, comments here in the chat section. I'm going to come back to that in a sec, because I think, boy, you guys have really sparked some conversation. This is great. I love this. So, you know, one of the things is we feel stuff. And some of us who are alexithymic, we feel it, but we don't always know how to maybe articulate or assign what we're feeling. But in the workplace, I think we've all experienced, no matter our neurotype, those really uncomfortable places to work, where you can't wait for 5 o'clock or whatever your clock out time is. You are getting your stuff ready 30 minutes or an hour beforehand so you can hit the door and get the heck out of there. You know, there's a culture sometimes that permeates in this really negative competitive environment. You know, there's a lot of aspects that are the unspoken signs that a culture is really not working. And when a culture is not working, we have really horrific retention rates. People don't want to stay. Our productivity declines, because when you don't feel like you can share ideas, there's no innovation, there's no creation, there's no communication that's effective. So I'm going to start with Jessica. What do you see as some of the things that, you know, maybe if we're a leader, if we are a company owner, or we're the employee, what are some things maybe we can't articulate, but we're feeling that's a result of maybe our culture, our company culture isn't really working for us or for our group?
Oh, yeah. If it's, you know, I think for a lot of people, something they don't realize is, especially if they're alexithymic, as you mentioned, Carol Jean, which I am, if people leave that building feeling drained, like if you feel when you're going home that you have nothing left, then a lot of times that is because your body is reacting to the stress and the negativity of that culture, and what the work you have to do just to exist there. And frankly, that happens regardless of your neurotype. But I think that is something, you know, that I never knew about myself, that I just thought I didn't experience stress, but I did have chronic daily migraines. And every 2 years or so, my body just shuts down for a couple of weeks, which apparently isn't normal. that's my body throwing up those flags saying, hey, something is wrong. So I think if you're experiencing that and people around you are experiencing that physical drain, then that is an excellent sign that the culture is not working for you.
Stacy, what have you or Tracy, go ahead, Tracy.
Sorry, I just like, I think one of the things here, and this is why I love conversations like this, is I think people think that that's normal, Jessica, that you're supposed to go to work and then feel completely drained after. Again, like we have this definition of what work is. And when we assume that that is normal, then we come home and we're feeling terrible, and then we yell at our kids and then we're feeling more terrible. And we think that that is just the cycle of what it's like to be a human, except it's not true, right? It's actually an indicator, like Jessica said, that you're in an environment that isn't doing it for you. And one of the examples I always love to give is I teach a cardio dance class. It is 1 hour of cardio dancing. And at the end of it, I feel so invigorated. Like I actually probably couldn't go into another hour of cardio, but I feel like I could go into another hour of cardio, right? So it's not about not doing work. It's not about like not putting in the work and having that kind of output, but it is about how you feel about the output. And it's the number one reason I quit my corporate job, because I was like, I don't feel like any of this output is worth anything. And it was to the business, right? And I'm sure it was to my clients and all those things, but it wasn't worth anything to me. And so I was like, I can't do it. How long am I going to do that? If I did that for the rest of my life, I would be crazy, right? Because I'm spending so much of me. It's like I was putting all this me effort into a completely generic list of tasks. Right? Like someone else can come here and do these tasks, and maybe they might even feel better about doing them because I feel totally indifferent in doing them. And if we could just have that type of conversation in a workplace and be like, not that there's something wrong with you because you don't like negotiating or you don't like accounting or you don't like graphic design, right? But that's not the thing that's meant for you. And maybe we could help you explore something different. And maybe you explore and you get it wrong. But I think that the idea of exploration in the work environment is, again, go back to this, like work is productivity. Productivity looks like this, checking boxes. Exploration doesn't exist in that type of culture, if we can call it a culture.
Oh, Tracy, you make such a great point there. I think that's one of those sort of warning signs, red flags. If you don't have the agency or the room or the support to explore at work. And I think that's, that's one of the things that Tracy and I have talked about before. And Tracy, you spoke about this, when you were running a sales team and you're like, hey, we've got these really amazing sales team members and they're telling us, making 30 calls or 50 calls a day isn't building the relationship. It's not meeting those KPIs, as you and I always laugh about, those KPIs, those metrics that we want to meet, those benchmarks. We're not hitting them, doing them like this because we're focused on these numbers, but we're not focused on the why, and we're not focused on the true outcome we're trying to achieve. So Stacy, if you had to say, like, these are some of the warning signs that your culture may need some work. We may need to revisit and do some alignment between our values and actually what's happening in our culture every day. What would you say those are?
Two things, well, many things in my brain come to mind in the conversation. One that Tracy highlighted around having an environment that the exploration, but also she kind of mentioned having autonomy and individuality, and having, even if we're all doing the same job, there are a lot of task-oriented things that have to get done. And if you have a truly diverse team, intersectionally, not just neurodiversity, you're going to be able to find people who enjoy, or at least don't mind, every administrative or necessary task, and be able to take from people the tasks that are really executive functioning tasks. For a lot of us are an issue that keeps people from moving forward when they have this barrier to. So I think individuality and not just looking at what do we all do as a job, what are all of our KPIs? And I want to get right back to the KPI conversation because that's the second thing for me. But looking at, we all have a group goal, we have an organizational goal, we have a goal as a team, and our team is a separate culture from the articulated culture of the organization. And then individually, I have core values and things that I enjoy and that light me up. And I think we're all talking a lot about the drain physically and emotionally of culture, and that being an indicator. The equal opposite, and Carol G, and this is something that you and I have talked about, that not having that spark is just as concerning as having the drain. You have to not be overstimulated with the things that are taking from you, and also not be understimulated when it comes to having a purpose, having a why, having things that excite you, knowing that if I have to do the executive function things I don't love, it's because they're going to get me to this other side of the things that I'm excited about, that balance. And the note on balance and getting back to the KPIs is, I do want to say, we're all talking about not checking boxes. And I think it's really important to mention here, because it's a big part of the data-driven training that I really love, is especially as a neurodivergent person with ADHD and on the spectrum, I do need numbers. Sometimes I do need tangible results. I do need to see this sort of ethereal, lovely feeling I need, and not everybody does, but I do need to see, okay, so if you need me to increase the production of sales, as was mentioned, I work a lot with sales teams. What does that look like in numbers? What does it look like at the end of the day, where I'm sort of frazzled in assessing whether or not I have gotten work done for the day? I had somebody in my previous organization say, you have to find a number that you can look at every single day that says, okay, I did something here, even if it wasn't meeting that main number. So it's not about checking boxes. It's not about doing the lip service, but there is an element of tracking and metrics and KPIs when supported by all of the other stuff, the culture and the values that are very valuable together. It just can't be one or the other. So that's an indicator. To answer your question, I think having one or the other, or one very strongly, we see more metrics and KPIs than we do. I haven't personally seen so many just culture feels without the KPIs, but I think having any very extremist views that don't allow for the intersectionality and coming together of different ways of thinking and assessing, that's a big indicator for me that your culture needs to be delved into and kind of fleshed out.
And it's so funny to me that some companies have ended up there by trying to be nice. Like, we have companies that have said, okay, we don't want any of those extremes. We want everybody to feel good. So we're going to have a friendly culture. And the challenge is, our definition of what is friendly is so narrow that it actually becomes exclusionary. So we've started discriminating all out of this idea that we're being inclusive. And by extension, we've taught a generation of employees that your leaders are going to look like this. They're going to sound like this. And if they don't, then you're not being led properly. They are wrong or bad. And we've also taught a bunch of colleagues, and that if somebody sounds to you this way or doesn't look this way, then they are not friendly and therefore not part of the friendly culture. None of that was done maliciously, but it has had some pretty scary downstream effects for anybody who expresses himself differently or thinks differently, even though that was what we were hoping to prevent.
Well, and I'm just going to play off of this, because a culture is about intersectionality, right? It is about how all of the people in the culture experience each other. And if we are just from the top, we're like, okay, we're all going to be friendly. This is the definition of friendly. It's not going to be about you and your definition of friendly and you showing up as your definition of friendly. It's going to be me dictating to you what friendly is, and therefore we're all going to show up that way. And so this is like one of the biggest issues with company values, is that people forget that every single person has a different interpretation of what that value means, right? So I use this example all the time because a company I worked for had a cares about people value. And so when I came back from maternity leave, I had it written into my contract that my in-office hours were 9 to 4 because I needed to drop my son off at daycare and I wanted to pick him up because family dinner was the most important thing to me at that time. And that was how I was going to make that happen. And constantly, my boss would ask me, she would schedule meetings for 4 o'clock. She would ask me to work in the evenings. And I was like, I wrote this into my contract because it's that important to me. It's not, and a lot of that doesn't get written into contracts, right? So like my interpretation of cares about people is that you listen to me when I'm telling you this is what's important to me, and you very minimally, because in the work environment, we can't always avoid emergencies and those types of things, but very minimally, it's about you recognizing when something you're asking me to do goes against what I've specifically asked for. Right. So like, I really need you to work on this tonight. And I appreciate that it is going to take away from your family time. And I'm going to find a way to make it up to you. Right. Like, and I don't know. And maybe you don't, right? Like maybe you don't find a way to make it up to you. At least I know that you saw me, right? That you appreciated that my interpretation of this value is that you're communicating to me when we are going against my definition of the values. But if one, we don't understand that everybody has a different interpretation of the values, and two, we don't have conversation about what our interpretation of the values are, then we can't know, right? If we don't have a conversation about what my interpretation of that means, you don't know, so you can't honor it, right? But we create this space of like, all words only have one meaning. And that's just not true at all.
Oh man, and we've got some great comments here in the chat box. There is also an illusion that everyone can manage this on an individual level without top-down help. That is such a true statement when we're talking about creating space to have conversations, just to share what our interpretation of that friendly, people-centered culture word means to us. How does that show up and really land for us? What does it mean from my perspective? And how does that look, behave, feel, and talk like, really getting that granular on and expressing that. So guys, I would like to, before we sort of move into our personal brand thing, what we're talking about here is how are we feeling? What are we experiencing in the workplace based on culture to kind of go, hey, this might not be working. This might be working for a handful of people, but this isn't working for us as a whole. And Stacy mentioned this. It's, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're not just talking about neurotypes. We're talking about all intersectional groups. And when we're not really being conscientious and not creating an environment where everyone has psychological safety, where they feel like they can share their personal experience and viewpoint without being judged, bullied, or ostracized, or risk maybe even being pushed out, because I've seen that happen where somebody gets brave and they're like, hey, there's a problem. This is kind of how I'm seeing it. This might be something we need to talk about. And everybody is like, thinking the same thing. They've all recognized it. They've all been suffering from the same thing, but they're like, oh, whoa, no, nobody will back them up. Nobody will say anything. And then all of a sudden that's like persona non grata. Right. And that person, then nobody wants to, they're like the pariah. Nobody wants to talk to them. Nobody wants to be around them. Nobody even wants to like come near their desk or anything, because they were brave enough to say what everybody was already thinking, because they cared enough to go, hey, let's try and fix this. But when you've got top-down support going, yeah, we're just not even going there. That's a leadership problem. That's not just a culture problem. That's a leadership problem. And we have leadership problems when our culture is not right. When the leaders of the company and the culture themselves aren't in alignment. And one of the things for the workforce, one of the biggest impacts is when we're in this type of culture that we just described, burnout happens. And burnout happens differently in different brain types. That's sort of my jam. But when we're talking about this, all neurotypes experience burnout. You experience dissatisfaction. You are experiencing an integrity gap because what you feel and believe, your value system, your personal brand inside who you are, you can't be that. You can't show up like that. You can't live that in the world. So there's this gap between who you are inside and actually what's happening in the world around you. And, you hear in the autistic and neurodivergent community, we talk about masking. And I, of course, say I masked to the professional level of camouflaging. And when you're doing that because you got to survive in a very maybe hostile, toxic, or just dysfunctional, I like to call them dysfunctional workplace, that's what's happening. And does anybody sustain that? Do we have growth? Do we have opportunity? Do we have productivity? Do we have authentic teams of communication and networking? Heck no. We're in survival mode. We're just scrapping it out to meet whatever the metric is to keep our darn job, to keep the paycheck coming, because we got to feed our kids, keep the lights on and all the stuff, put gas in our car, which, by the way, is just like killing everybody lately. So, that's one of those things. So what I would like to really talk about is why is it so important? What are some of the benefits of having not just a neurodiverse culture, but a culture that is inclusive of as many populations and people as possible and different neurotypes? Tracy, what would you say? What are the things? What are some of the benefits that you've experienced that you see?
The number one thing that always comes to mind for me is innovation. Right? And we all talk about how innovation is so important, but innovation doesn't come from a whole bunch of people thinking the same way, thinking about the same thing. Right? Like, it's just not a thing. It comes from a variety of experiences, being able to share their voice, and people, it's not about taking everybody's idea all the time, right? Because this is a workplace. We do have to get stuff done. We have to make a decision. Somebody's idea isn't going to get chosen, right? Like, and that being a good human and being able to take care of your people is a separate skill set. We really should talk about more and value more highly in the workplace. But it's about people being heard, being seen, knowing that they're valued. And you talked about feelings, Carol Jean, right? And feelings is another one of those things that has been frowned upon in the work environment since the 80s, right? Like, it's like we put on our shoulder pad jacket, we go to the office, and then we don't have feelings anymore. And you're like, we can pretend that that's true, but it's not true, right? Like, I go to work and I feel emotional, right? Like, I make a mistake, I feel bad about it. I see somebody struggling, it makes me distracted, right? Like, these are normal human emotions. And if we pretend that people don't have normal human emotions at work, then we can't create a space of listening and acceptance, because listening and acceptance means I hear that you're struggling right now. I hear that you're hurting right now. And I know, let's be honest, in the corporate work environment, the number of things that are urgent are almost nothing, right? Can we not? I had this really amazing experience. So earlier this summer, my father-in-law passed away, and I found out at like 9:55, and I had a meeting at 10 o'clock. And so I got on the meeting at 10 because I had absolutely no space to process that information yet. And I was like, I'm just going to go to this meeting. It's a like procedural meeting. I'll just walk through it, make sure everybody knows what they need to do, and then process it, right? I was super lucky because the people I was having a meeting with are all in this conversation. And the number one thing, so one of my teammates made me promise when I met him, we were like, we're going to work together on this project. What you have to promise me is that if I ask you how you are, you tell me the truth. And so he asked me how I was. And I was like, well, I don't know. I don't know how I am, right? Like, I just got this news. I have not had time to process it, and I don't know. And we took the first 20 minutes of the meeting for me to just be. There was times where I was just sitting silently and crying. There was times where I was talking. There was times where I was sharing stories. And then we had a very productive 10-minute meeting that got all the things done. But there was also this like level of connection that happened because we took the time. And I think it was you, Jessica, that mentioned earlier about like investing money, or it might have been Stacy, investing money into these initiatives, right? But like, we really don't have to invest money into these initiatives. We need to invest time. We need to invest time in people so that they can feel seen, so that they contribute to innovation. Because who wants, I don't think any company actually wants this, right? To like have all these amazingly intelligent people that you're paying a decent salary come to work and not tell you their ideas. Because what if their ideas can help you, right? Like, they don't think that's what we want, but that's what we show up and we do with our actions, right? So I think it's really important if we, let's just say, I want to challenge all of the companies. So anybody watching this right now who has innovation on your values, are you creating spaces where different brains, different ideas, even bad ideas, are celebrated? Because if you don't reward the things that matter, it's not going to happen. So just check yourself against your innovation goal, because innovation is not available unless we are giving people permission to be themselves.
I do just want to point out, though, I wanted to point out, if companies do want to spend a bunch of money, my website is www.coachjessicamichaels.com. So
there are places where that money is. I also
is available to you. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mind Your Autistic Brain will take it all day long. Just give us a call. Neurodrive team will help.
Okay. You know what? I will tell you, I'll take your money too, you guys. But at the end of the day, if you're not going to promise to dedicate time to the people, I don't actually want to take your money, right? So if you're going to pay me a whole bunch of money and then not do the things, because this is what I'm going to tell you. You need to create time. You need to create space. If you're not interested in creating time or space, forget the investment, because you're actually throwing away your money.
Oh, 100%. And Stacy talks about that too for what she does.
Absolutely. And that's an element of when I go into an organization, we all know everybody here does some level of consulting, which is one of those other words that's like, what is that? And I know that everything I impart on a company is not gonna, you're really successful in consulting if you, about 20% of what you teach sticks. But the element that you highlighted, Tracy, of being seen and heard and being able to innovative leadership and culture, it cannot exist without diversity of just about every perspective, every walk of life, every neurotype. Those are almost synonymous with one another. And the element that you kept bringing up of different ideas, and they're not all going to be accepted, that's collaboration, right? We're all here to brainstorm, and I know a lot of what I'm saying. I'm processing externally. That's how I process. And I know a lot of it's going to not be a good idea, but I needed to say it, and I needed to get it out, and I needed to be heard and seen. And so collaboration doesn't mean we all get to be a part of the decision in the sense that it's all going to be what we want, but the other end of that connection, that empathy that you spoke about, is I understand when I'm in a team that truly values collaboration, that truly values connection, that I'm able to bring all of my ideas, good, bad, and indifferent, all of my thoughts, all of my feelings to the space. And then everybody else can do the same. And we can kind of together figure out what works for that instance or this team at this time. So it's not about saying, I get to be me and you get to be you and you get to be you, and we're all in vacuums. It's about, we get to be our whole selves. And then we get to define what the team is with all of those individual preferences, needs, feelings, thoughts, ideas. That truly is innovation and a thriving team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think, because none of the stuff that we've talked about, I think, is controversial. Nobody goes to work saying, I'm going to be a jerk. And no manager goes to work and saying, I'm going to make my whole team mad at me. And like, we don't go to work to cause people to feel negative things. But that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be negative feeling at work. And one of the things, when we talk about all the good stuff, which is a salesperson, of course, we're going to talk about all the good stuff. It leads people to think that, okay, this process is always going to feel amazing. And the second it doesn't feel amazing, the process is wrong. And where that starts to really hurt, first, it curtails innovation, but it also goes against this inclusivity because we spend a lot of time telling people that however you interpret whatever information you got, you were right. However you feel, that's the most important thing. And it is very, very important. However, in that team environment, there has to be space to be able to say, okay, this is what this person got. Is that what you wanted them to get from that comment? Is that what you put out there? Because we've sort of biased everything to the point of if you feel something, it is right because there is a right. And that person who made you feel that way is wrong. And now you've chased all the autistics out of the room. I think there's this thing about toxic employees and cancerous employees. And I always just wonder, and I've been both. I always just wonder how many of those employees are actually burnt out autistics who have just been totally unsupported and told that their very presence is bad and wrong because the way they communicate has been villainized. So I think, these processes are not always super squishy and kumbaya and all friendly. Sometimes it's, you got to learn some things about yourself too. And I think those parts need to be valued as much as, oh, look, isn't it fun when we all get along?
Well, and I think that comes back to the importance of coaching, right? Is that from the education system is built on teaching us what is right and what is wrong. And that when we get it right, we're rewarded. And when we get it wrong, we're punished or very minimally ashamed of what we did because we're wrong. But when it comes to ideas, when it comes to ways of being, when it comes to ways of processing information, there is no right and wrong. There just is, right? There's my way of processing information. There's Jessica's way of processing information. Just because Jessica heard something different or interpreted that in a different way because one thing is her brain processes it differently, but also her background is different and her culture is different and how she was raised was different and everything she's seen is different, right? So the problem is that when we see something different, we think that if it's not the same, I might be wrong. And society is created and the world of work participates in it as well, right? Like wrong is bad. Therefore, I will do everything in my power not to be wrong. But as long as we have individuals in an organization, specifically if we have individuals in leadership capacities that are coming to work and they refuse to be wrong, again, can you come back to innovation for a second? That doesn't create innovation, right? Like all it does is keep you stuck in whatever box you're currently in. And unless we accept that someone else can know something more than us, can know something different than us, and that's good, then we still have this problem, right? And this is why we need coaches, because unless we coach the individual people to work through what that is for them and how it's having an impact on the rest of the team, that person will still be a roadblock for all the things.
And that's what I love, because, one of the things that we talk about in our NeuroDrive team when we're saying, okay, what are some of the benefits, but, what are some of the roadblocks and the barriers that are coming up? And, maybe those roadblocks or barriers that people are viewing as such, because that's what they've quote unquote identified them to be, the person who asks why 20 times in a meeting, and the person that says all the ways that this project isn't going to succeed and all the problems that, why it's not going to work. And they get termed or coined the problem child, or, the toxic or cancerous employee, whatever you want to term it. But what our team says is, hey, hang on a second. Is it making you feel uncomfortable? Is that person and the way they're communicating or the ideas that they're bringing to the table or the comments that they're making? Number one, you're interpreting through your lens and your perspective why they say something, but you hadn't asked them. and you hadn't checked yourself, because if you're feeling uncomfortable or you're feeling a little, please be quiet or stop asking questions, or you're getting frustrated or whatever, you need to maybe ask yourself why. And then you need to actually start having a conversation. I worked with a team and they had an individual that they're like, this guy, every time we start a project, we're just like rolling everything out. We're spitballing ideas. We're putting things out there. It's kind of the framework. Everybody's excited. And he's got a laundry list. He's showing up with why it's not going to work. And it just kills it just kills everybody's mood. I was like, well, wait a minute. Let's think about this for a second. Have you thought about what he's presenting? Have you asked him why he shows up with that list? Well, no, he's just negative. I'm like, are you sure about that? Turns out this guy is so invested in this project being successful. And his brain worked in a way that could see these roadblocks and these barriers and these problems 500 steps ahead. And he didn't want the project to hit these. He was like, hey, this is what it is. So I'm like, well, how about you guys do a little bit different strategy in how you set up this project planning meeting? Why don't you start with, these are all of the ideas. We're really excited about them. And we know that because we all want to be successful, that this guy is going to come and really make sure we're going to be successful. So let's kind of listen to what his suggestions are. Let's listen to what he's seeing. And instead of immediately shutting it down and assuming and assigning an emotion to something, let's just do a check with ourselves and let's actually check in with the person. Because when the guy found out that everybody in the room thought he was just being negative and didn't want the project to succeed, he was devastated, because what he wanted was for this to work. But, we have a comment here that I think is really important, and that they want to know from the whole group here. How do you all deal with the catch-22 of, quote unquote, if I don't identify as autistic, people think I'm extra and not good at socializing, versus if I do, everyone assumes I am not as good? So I'm trying to understand this. Like, see, if I don't identify as autistic, people think I'm extra. Oh, okay. So if I don't come out and I'm not like telling everybody I'm autistic, then they just think I'm kind of extra. I'm a little much. I'm like too TOO, like too enthusiastic, too over the top, too quiet, too reserved. If I do disclose that I'm autistic, everyone assumes I'm not as good. Ooh, Jessica.
Yeah, because this describes my client base, right? I work with managers. I develop leaders, and most of them, I started off saying, oh, I work with neurodiverse leaders, but really I work with the people that have strong personalities and that are too much, and, who just need to take a chill pill and just relax. And because those people are, well, me, but also it doesn't matter what your neurotype is, frankly, or if you've gotten a diagnosis or not. You are who you are, and people are who they are. So disclosing, certainly, that whether you do that has a whole, there's a whole conversation behind that. But even if you don't disclose, you're still a person with preferences, a person with strengths, a person with opportunities. I will go ahead and say weaknesses, because I don't necessarily feel like that's a bad word. And it's about then kind of crafting your situation to work with the things that you're really strong in, to find a way to grow in those areas that you have opportunities in, finding a way to mitigate those areas of weakness, which is exactly the same thing we do when somebody is autistic and wants accommodations. We're like, okay, what do you do super well? And what's super easy for you? What are things that we can modify to help you? And then what are things that just aren't going to work no matter what we do, that we need to look at? So I think how you approach that doesn't necessarily have to change whether or not you choose to disclose, because at the end of the day, it doesn't change how you present at work. It is because you're you, and you're going to continue to be you, whichever direction you choose to go.
Stacy, what are your thoughts on this one?
Any thoughts on disclosure? And Jessica, kind of that's a separate conversation just because of, ADA accommodations and all of that. And my all of the work that I do is to eradicate that need from the workplace entirely. And like Jessica said, it is being on the spectrum myself and having ADHD and only being diagnosed with my late 20s with ADHD and very recently as on the spectrum. I navigated as me, and a lot of us can identify with that commenter and saying, how do you navigate being looked at as too much or extra or whatever that word is? And I think there's two parts to that. One is I'm trying not to get too deep into my mental health background that I spent a decade in, but we're talking a lot about conflict and looking at conflict and opportunity as the same thing. They're not bad. They're an opportunity to move forward and work on things. And so how you navigate in the workplace is going to largely depend on what work you've done outside of the workplace. And I know a lot of us here do coaching with individuals to help people to find how to advocate for themselves outside of disclosure, outside of HR and accommodations. And also knowing that once, speaking specifically to someone who identifies as autistic, you probably have a special interest, or you probably have things within your role that are very difficult for you, as well as things that are really exciting for you that you might not get to do as much. And so there are boundaries in the workplace. There are things you can and can't say, and that's okay. It's the same difference as the fact that my partner is a golfer, loves to golf. I don't know any of the terminology. I'm not the best place for him to disclose all of his golfing term, though he does a lot. But it's not about saying, oh, well, I can't be my full self if I can't tell everybody that I'm autistic at work. It's just that there are certain boundaries in place for everyone that it may not be relevant. What's relevant is who you are and what things within knowing that, again, on your own and your individual work with that and identifying that, you may be able to operate as your full self and be known and seen without disclosing that diagnosis. That's a very personal decision. So it's not, the disclosure conversation isn't about whether or not it's okay or safe to, so much as whether or not, for me, it's necessary. And the answer for me is it is, because it's one of my special interests, is neurodiversity. It may not be though for you, and that's okay. It's okay to not disclose and still feel like people know you underneath that.
Man, Stacey, you couldn't have teed us up for this next part of the conversation any better. I love that. We've talked about what culture means to us. We've talked about when a culture, what do you feel and observe? What are the things in the culture when it's not working? What actually are the benefits of having a thriving culture? And we're going to talk about now how your personal brand plays into that. Tracy, would you kick us off with number one, what is your personal brand? How do you define that? Like, what the heck is a personal brand? Like, this is like a big buzzword that's happening. It's not everybody knows exactly what does it mean, personal brand. Like, I know like company brand, I know like Nike's a brand, but like, what's your personal brand? What the heck is that?
Well, I will tell you guys my definition, but I will also tell you that I wrote a post on LinkedIn yesterday about how you need to create your own definition for things to be successful in your life. So you can take my definition on as advice and try it on and see if it fits you. My definition of your personal brand is the experience you leave other people with when you leave the room. And so I think a lot of times as individuals, we think, if we're going to enter into the personal branding arena, that's for entrepreneurs, right? For people who are running their own business, they need to have a personal brand, but I don't need to have a personal brand. What I'm here to tell you is that you have a personal brand, because any human that has interacted with another human has left an experience with that human. And the best thing about that is when we're not thinking too much about it, we just show up as ourselves and we just be and we say what we would naturally say. That's your personal brand, golden moments, right? The problem with work is that we think we need to be different than we are in order to be accepted, in order to be successful, in order to be professional, in order to be blah. And I'll be honest with you, it is a narrative that has been sold to you by society for a very long time, but it is not true. Right? It is absolutely not true. And the number one thing I see that helps or contributes to failure in an interview process is not being yourself, right? When you show up and you like put on this overly emphasized mask, and people can tell when you're trying to just be what you think I want to be, but we haven't had enough conversation for you to actually know what I want you to be. So there's just a weird vibe, right? And because your personal brand is that experience, that's what people leave the room with, this weird vibe experience. But that's not who you are. That's because you're trying to be someone else. So if we can try and peel away all of these reasons, all of these times, right, all of these situations, all of these places where we feel like we need to show up as somebody different than ourselves, then we can start to explore how we can not do that. Because before we identify where that's happening, we can't actually go through that. And for to just address the question quickly about like, well, what this, there's always people who are going to think you're too much, whether or not they know you're autistic or they don't know you're autistic. There's always going to be people who like you, who don't like you. If you're an entrepreneur and you're listening to this conversation, you're going to show up and you're going to say something on social media, and some people are going to love it and some people are going to hate it, right? You're going to go into an interview as a potential employee and say something that doesn't work for the employer. And that's actually good, because that helps you figure out whether or not this is a good match. If I'm always trying to give you the right answer, in which there is not a thing, there is no one right answer. So if I go in and I'm putting all this effort into like giving you the right answer, I'm not giving you my real answer. I don't know what you think the right answer is. So now I'm just putting like some random answer out into the universe that is completely irrelevant. And so if I can show up and be me, and I know I make it sound simple, you guys, it isn't, we have been taught for a very long time to look and be a specific way, right? So breaking those patterns, even identifying those patterns and then breaking those patterns is work. It's like Jessica said, it's just like, you can't actually do any kind of personal branding activity without it feeling crappy sometimes. And you're going to be like, oh man, I can't believe I did that for years. And there's this forgiveness procedure that you have to go through. And like, my old self didn't know that, right? So my old self couldn't have made decisions that way, but my new self can now make decisions that way. And then it's a process, right? So let's assume you listen to this today and you're like, oh, okay, I'm in a job search right now. I'm going to go into my next interview and be more myself, right? And then what you notice is that you're like, oh, every time someone asks me about my diagnosis, I don't think you're allowed to actually ask about that. But like people ask me about my weaknesses, right? And I always feel like really uncomfortable sharing what my weaknesses are. Like I'm at the point where I'm like, you know what? I have a weakness in negotiation, which I used to think was a huge problem when I was in high level leadership, because you have to be a good negotiator in order to be a CEO, right? Not true. Actually, the definition of good negotiating was the thing that again, tell your own definition. My definition of good negotiating and my boss's definition of good negotiation were not the same thing. So I could effectively negotiate based on my definition, but not on her definition. So it looked like I was failing. But this is the place we get to, right? This is not the place you start today. This is the conversation starter today. But it's about getting to a place where you can show up and be like, what feels right today? Do I tell people that I'm autistic? Sure, it feels like the right thing to do in this scenario. And some days, maybe you don't. I have a client actually who has recently entered into Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was going to this big sales conference, and he was like, what do I do? Do I tell people I'm in AA? Do I just like not drink? What if people ask me about it? Blah, blah, blah. And I was like, dude, if you feel called to tell somebody, then tell them that. That doesn't mean you have to stand up in front of the conference and be like, I'm in AA, I can't have a drink, right? Like, you don't have to do that. You can decide. You can decide when it's right for you to tell people, and you can decide when it's not right for you to tell people. And there isn't one right or one wrong answer. It's about you figuring out how you feel about revealing this in a specific scenario with a specific person, and knowing that your experience of that is valid. That's the truth for you. And I really like, Jessica touched on this a while ago about like other people are having other experiences, right? So it can't just be about my experience, but it can be about you separating your experience from someone else's experience. So I like to use dress codes as an example for this, right? Like, go to work, if there's a dress code, you're probably gonna have to dress appropriately to the dress code, right? Like, but that doesn't have to be your style, right? So like, this is my style, this is the dress code. Now that I know that these are two separate things, I can figure out how to deal with this because they're two separate things. But I am not the dress code. I am not my job title. I am not autistic, right? Like, it's not the only thing you are, right? And when we can separate those pieces of our identity, because we all have multiple pieces of our identity, and say like, okay, my personal brand is a combination of all of these things. Sometimes I show up as autistic. Some days I show up as a mom. Some days I show up as a basketball player. Some days I might show up as more of one of those things. But when I don't, it's about not pretending that the other parts of you don't exist when you're showing up in one way.
Ooh,
and
that's a good
you
one,
don't
Trace.
have to, you don't have to tell people that you're autistic, but it's not about you trying to filter out your autism. It's about you being that. If you want to tell people straight up, I'm a basketball player, great. But if you don't, that doesn't mean you're any less you because you didn't do it. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I love that because, that's part of it. And that's part of sort of the late identified process is that identity crisis that, oh my gosh, I'm not who I thought I was my whole life. There's this layer. I knew there was something. I just didn't know what it was. Now I know what it is. And now I got to figure out who the heck I am, what my personal brand is. And part of the conversation today is, how do you bring your personal brand to work in a way that works with your company brand? So Jessica, I'd love to know some of your thoughts on how do we integrate this as neurodivergent people? How do we show up in a way that feels good, that feels authentic to us? We don't have to tell the world. That's our choice. But how do we show up so that we're not in a chronic state of survival masking and not being totally drained at the end of the day, but we're being able to show up, even if it's just little pieces of ourselves as we start to bring those big things. Because, I always say, I'm not everybody's jam. That's okay. Some people like strawberry, some people like grape, and I'm more strawberry.
First of all, you are everybody's jam, Carol Jean. I think you're universally the only person who, and everybody. So anybody I talk to and I'm like, Carol Jean, they're like, I love Carol Jean. So first of all, just that's a side note, yeah. But I think it is important. That's why I think culture is so critical, because employees can't do it by themselves. I can't make my workplace totally fine for me without help. And for me, often the most important person is my direct leader. And then secondary to that is often my colleagues. So if I'm working with my direct leader and he knows that I really need to have a flexible schedule, sometimes I log in at 8, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 9, but I always hit my deadlines. And sometimes I'm out at 4 or 5, or I've got, I'm out in the middle of the day. Then he doesn't need to know that that's because sometimes I just have to lay down because my brain is tired, my eyes are tired, I can't do it, so I need to lay down. He just knows that flexibility is something that helps me bring my best self to work and do the best job. So I think as you develop a culture of preferences it can be as small as that team level. We all know that manager who's like, well, we don't have an official work from home policy, but that manager's team never comes in. And that's because they don't necessarily care where their employees do their work, as long as their work gets done. It's what works best for that team, and so they're able to do that. And I think you can be as open and positive and be as authentic as you can at work. And there's little stresses that you can try to alleviate from yourself. But I really think the smallest level that truly that can happen at for long-term success is with your direct leader and direct colleagues and team, unless you work for yourself and you're an entrepreneur. But other than that, you really need that. But it's very easy to build with each other, and it doesn't cost anything.
See, this is why your brain always sparks me. And you say, I leave you with a list of stuff to do. You always leave me with a list of stuff to do. And I think I just got another one. Guys, part of this is we're not just for our personal brand. That's just not like who we are and how we show up in the world. How do we stand in more of our authenticity and, which parts of us are we showing up with? Sure. But I think one of the most critical components to that is you're the CEO, you're the leader in your own life, number one. But you're also leading other people, whether you have a title or not. There's something called emotional contagion. And how you show up in the world is spreading. And the question is, well, what am I spreading? I'm a leader just no matter what my position, whatever my title is, because that's part of who I am in my life. And the question is, are you the leader in your own life, or are you following other people? And it's okay to follow other people, but you also have to check in with, how am I showing up to lead my life, to make those decisions and those choices of, if I show up a strawberry grape jam today, and that is a really critical part. And as actual titled leaders in a company, to know that how you lead, how you show up, when you are getting courageous and brave and authentic and really not showing up as, shoulder pads and, all buttoned up and very serious and I have no emotions and we're ticking off the boxes. Okay, we've all discussed today that model is broken, folks. That was some idea somebody had back in business school in the 80s and it got in a book and it is not working, folks. The Great Resignation is screaming, this is not working. The well-being that we create in our work environment, what we're looking for is authenticity. We're looking to be seen, heard, understood, and acknowledged. And one of my wonderful mentors, Judy Umlis, wrote a book called The Power of Acknowledgement. If you are a leader, if you're a leader in your own life, or you're looking to be a leader in your own life, the power of acknowledgement starts with ourselves, acknowledging our own strengths, acknowledging what we do really well and where we're weak, where we just suck at doing something. Because believe me, I have a list of those things. I suck at a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff I really suck at. There's a lot of stuff I'm really good at. And Jessica says, Girl Jean, you love doing this. You're really good at this. And I suck at it. Can you do that? I'm like, yes, because I need you to do this because I really suck at this.
And that's the crux of team building though, right? And this is the thing. If you have people who can't come to work and say, these are my strengths, these are my weaknesses, you can't create that balance. I used to do this activity with my employees called the love-loathe list. And we did it once a quarter. And it was just going through like, what are the parts of your job that you love? What are the parts of your job that you loathe? And then there's always a whole bunch of stuff that's just kind of in the middle, right? Like I'm indifferent about doing these things. And every single time we did it, we would be like I had an employee who was like, I loathe working on PowerPoint presentations because her brain just didn't see things in a visual way. So it was very hard for her. And I was like, I love working on PowerPoint presentations. I would love to do the PowerPoint presentations. And you can take this thing that you said you love that I loathe, and we can just trade. And it worked so well because it's not about everybody doing things they love 100% of the time. It's not possible. It's not possible as an entrepreneur either, people, just so you know. We still have to do accounting. I personally, I'm a sales and marketing person. So I like the sales and marketing, but I don't like the accounting. Some people don't like the sales and marketing when you're an entrepreneur, right? Jobs aren't about always doing what you love 100% of the time. It is about finding things that spark you. So when you have to go and do, like, I really should have planned to do accounting right after this because I knew that I would have energy coming out of it. And then I'd be like, oh yeah, totally energized. And I know that accounting is going to drain that. So I have to do it. Or I hire an accountant, but like, that's how you decide, right? That's the thing. I had a coach once that was like, you need to outsource your social media because the number one thing, you don't want to spend time doing social media. And I was like, are you nuts? I love social media. I love having conversations with new people. Like, that's a fun thing for me. Why would I outsource it? That's crazy. But if you can't talk about it, right, then you don't know. And if we're not creating spaces, and I just think, I talk a lot about creating spaces, but I think if an individual can't do that for themselves, if they can't create the space for themselves to do that, and Jessica, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this too, because you work a lot with leaders. The leader can't create space for themselves to explore. How are they supposed to create space for their team to explore? Right? You need to be able to do that. You need to prioritize doing that. It needs to be, shall I say, a KPI of how much time did you create for yourself to explore today? Right? Like, because sometimes that time can be so powerful, and it doesn't, I think a lot of times people too think this has to be a lot of time, right? Like, I'm talking about creating time and space for my people. Like, when else are they going to do their job? You know how much time is wasted in a corporate work environment every day? We're not even going to talk about it today because we'll go on a completely different trajectory. But
a woman that did time studies in a hospital, I can tell you.
Like, what if we took that? Or like my example, right? What if we took the first 20 minutes to just actually have a clearing round to help people get things off of their chest? And then we could actually get everything we needed to do done in 10 minutes because we did that. We didn't spend any more time, right? We had 30 minutes on the calendar. We just used the time to optimize the human inputs. Right?
Oh,
and if we're not doing that, then what are we doing?
I don't know. So Stacey, what are we doing? What are your thoughts on like personal brand and company culture, and how do we integrate those? How do we show up with our personal brand, and how do we as companies and cultures create spaces for that?
That is, to me, the full circle of this whole conversation, is to get right back to where we started. And, we talk about, I love groups of three because that feels like a circle to me. And the group of three for me, when what I do is the recruiting and hiring, the team building, which involves both sides, and then the leadership consulting. Those three parts are all about building a culture that has the two elements coming together of I think to answer your question on how do we do this, what does that mean? There are your own values. And I would highly encourage anybody who hasn't, Brene Brown has an exercise on her website about defining your personal values. And it's not 10 or 12, it's 2. What are your 2 primary core values as a human being? Mine are intimacy and growth. And my third would probably be faith. And so I have to find an environment in which my core, not all 10 I have a lot of values that go within that, but my core values are not in direct contradiction to the organization and the team. I don't have a team that's cool doing the status quo, doesn't want to grow, is like, look, this is how we've always done things, so this is how it's going to be. That's a direct contradiction with my personal values. So I need to know what my personal values are, what my team values are, and what my organizational values are, and that they don't all have to look the same. They won't. Your organization's there to make money predominantly. They're there to serve their clients and all of that, but they're there to make money. There's going to be a lot of difference, but is there a direct contradiction? And you cannot know if there's a direct contradiction and therefore know on the other end, that when you go to work every day, okay, I don't agree with this decision or this little piece, but overall I'm aligned in values. You can't know which of those situations it is until you articulate and define those things. So as an organization, as a team, and as an individual, to bring that all together, and there are lots of ways that I know all of us here probably help organizations and individuals do this, but look into ways in which you can define those values. And they're not just feelings. Feelings are great, they come from values, but you, in my experience, will always have this lack of clarity until you have those things defined. And in that way too, you can point back to, hey, you said that one of our core values, I know Tracy mentioned this earlier, a core value of caring about people, which I won't, give my opinion on that that's not an actual value of the organization, but what does that mean? And so when we can define, maybe that involves empathy. Empathy is a value. I value hearing and seeing and understanding somebody else's perspective, regardless, it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not I agree. I can then say, when I know I'm not feeling or seeing empathy on my team or in myself, that's a direct contradiction of the values that I have defined. So personal branding is about knowing your values and your exact and defined ways of moving through the world, and whether or not the organization that you're with or that you're building as an entrepreneur is in line with those core values. That's the beginning of a very nuanced conversation about how do you do all of that. But that's the primary foundational one in my experience, is having those defined and articulated and going from there.
Oh man, we couldn't have wrapped up this conversation on a better note, because if you didn't notice, there were a lot of bobbing heads over here as you were talking. We were all like, yes, 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 yes. You just nailed it, Stacey. Thank you so much. Ladies, this has been a really powerful conversation today. And I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody that has joined us live today, that has been sharing in the chat box. You've got some fans out there. I am seeing all kinds of messages here from everybody, like cheering Stacey, cheering Jessica, cheering Tracy, saying, yes, spot on. This was so good. This really has helped. That this has been really thoughtful responses from everybody. We've got a beautiful quote here. Huge plus on values. I mean, I think we just spoke to a lot of hearts today and a lot of heads. And part of the whole series here on Autistics in the Workforce this month, led by the Neurodrive team, is to start opening these conversations, to have some of these uncomfortable things that we know we all think, but we don't always say, right? Well, I'm autistic and ADHD. I'm going to say them. We're just going to say it. We're just going to talk about it. We'll just, everybody just sit here getting comfortable with being uncomfortable for a little bit, because the purpose and the passion that I have is to make sure that we're transforming within ourselves in a way that we are stepping into and embracing our personal brand, so that we're not feeling like we're showing up every day as a masked version of ourselves, that the workplace is actually supporting us in a way that we can thrive, that we can show up and be innovative and be creative and say, hey, I see like 10 different ways this is just going to go sideways if we don't talk about this first, and not be seen as the negative Nancy and all of the other things, because we all have different preferences, different needs. And ultimately, the goal is that we are creating environments where we are all able to thrive and perform and be creative and be energized and not be drained, burned out, exhausted, overwhelmed, frustrated, feel like we got to throw our hands up. Nobody cares. Nobody sees me. They hired me. Like Tracy said in our interview, they hired me because I'm a candle, but then they're running around snuffing us out. We're working on changing that today. If you are a company or if you're an individual looking for a coach to help make this transformation, we have a beautiful room full of coaches here. The Neurodrive team has executive coaching packages available, and we are here to help companies create these spaces in a neurodiverse way. We look at all brain types, not just our own, but we have a perspective of our own, which really helps because it may not be your neurotype. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks so much, Tracy and Stacy Andrews and Jessica Michaels. And that's Borison, by the way, Tracy Borison, I didn't say. So thank you so much for being here. Make sure that you go connect with all of these incredible professionals on LinkedIn. They will have all of their information. I'll come back and pop it in the details below so you can connect with them. Make sure that you're finding a way to step into your personal brand, find your alignment, find your personal leadership in your life. Thanks, guys. Okay.